After this. I was going to play this, is what I was going to do. Let's do that. Okay, so we have. Okay, and what I particularly want to look at for a moment is this final cadence where the predominant 4 chord moves us to the complete 5/7 at the perfect authentic cadence with scale degree 1 in the soprano. Because what happens is the shape of the melody, right, is what's sort of forcing the drop to scale degree 2 here and then down to 1 at the end.
Yeah.
But when preceded by the predominant 4 chord, that does create this leap of a third here and here. Okay? And as we saw with the 5/7 chord, right, where a leap of the third was then filled in with a passing tone, right? Yes. This is another point in the sort of harmonization that it's real tempting, and eventually composers do add those passing tones. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, and so now we have. Right, and that sounds very natural. Right? It's quite pretty.
Yes.
Yeah, so those passing tones actually make good musical sense. The question is, if you're then going to try to harmonize this moment, not just use those as passing tones, but to create an entire chord here, right? Let's talk about that. Here we have scale degree 3, E in the key of C, and we have scale degree 5, G in the key of C. Without getting too elaborate, just thinking of the chords that we talked about thus far, if I'm talking about scale degree 3 and scale degree 5,
1.
Yeah, the assumption is we're talking about some sort of 1 chord. And so the alto quite easily
could stay on the C.
Could simply stay on the C. Right? And then so there we have that.
The bass.
So the question though is what to do with the bass. And what's it's tempting to go, oh well, you could just have the reposition. But a couple things. One, this is no longer predominant. It's now we just have atomic expansion. I mean, right?
Yeah.
If the idea of this harmony really was, instead of going 1, 5, 1, 1, 4, 5, kind of have that little appoggiatura pattern, 4, 5, right? Then we don't want 1, 4, 1, 5, right? We broke up the bass line that this chord had intentionally created. Does that make sense? So if I don't want to screw up that bass line, then what note do I really want to use in the bass instead of the C?
You could go down 1 to an E.
You could. No, that's so instead of 1, 4, 3, 5, 1.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty good. I will say one problem you're gonna have there is this. You'd have to rethink the soprano here. Really, the idea was that we were going to create these passing tones because then now you're going to have parallel octaves.
So you're just already going to the G.
Yeah, so, to keep the sort of bass line, the idea of 4, 5, right? You could go ahead and go to the 5 here.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Gotcha.
And so if the idea is that we are creating these 2 passing tones that we then want to harmonize, that's the way to do it. Does that make sense? And so we now actually have the tonic chord, but not in root position.
Yeah.
And that you've heard all your life. I mean, because that's just a sensible way to sort of harmonize that. So we have the 1 chord, but again, it's not in root position. But there's a reason it's not in root position, because we need a different bass note to sort of keep the shape of the bass line that we were trying to create from the outset. And that's what I really want to impress upon students about chords and inversion. You invert chords to create some sort of shape in the bass that would have been interrupted or destroyed's a hard word, but certainly discombobulated if we had simply stuck to root position chords. Okay, so chords in inversion, they do not happen at random. There are specific patterns into which they fit. And this is one, and you can see historically why this chord was invented and why it goes right here. Okay, because there are these naturally occurring passagems that we harmonize, and therefore we create this chord. Now, one thing to look at, and this is how I talk about the figured bass for chords in inversion. If I had a G in the bass, and I asked you to just improvise a harmony on a G in the bass, without getting fancy, the assumption would be that the chord you're looking for in the key of C is what?
Dominant chord.
Yeah, I mean, we would assume that to this point, right, this is the first example where this had not been true. If G's in the bass, that's your harmony.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's the understanding. And again, in the Baroque period, musicians improvised off the bass line. That's, today we improvise off a chord chart, but, or, traditionally, but in the Baroque period, they actually improvised off the bass line. And, if the G were just in the bass, you just add the B and D above it, and there's your harmony.
Yeah.
But right here, we're actually after something different, right? We've got G in the bass, but what I'm asking you to add to that is the C and the G of the tonic chord, right, in inversion, G in the bass. Does that make sense? And the nomenclature for this, if I had wanted you to improvise this harmony in the Baroque period, I would have just simply written the G. But if I wanted you to improvise this harmony, I would describe the intervals above the bass as a sixth and a fourth. Does that make sense? Because the sixth and the fourth are not what you are expecting to appear.
Right.
Okay? So, what we do in modern times is we say this is a tonic chord, but is a tonic 6/4 harmony because it's not in root position. It is arranged in such a way that the bass note has a sixth and a fourth above it. And so what you have to memorize, right, in theory, is that 6/4 means the chord is actually in what we call second inversion, right, where the fifth is in the bass. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But that's where that comes from, and I think sometimes students, they do the right thing and memorize 6/4 means second inversion, and then they completely forget why it's 6 and 4. But if you can wrap your mind around it, that's why.
Yeah.
Okay. And although that may seem like a kind of an interesting harmony to start with, I'm introducing inversion with a second inversion chord. We haven't gotten to first inversion yet, but I think it's kind of important to start here because you really begin to see why this chord fits here, right? It really impresses upon you that, again, chords do not happen, inverted chords do not happen at random, they happen in patterns. And this is the pattern in which the 1/6/4 tends to show up, okay? And so we call this the cadential 1/6/4, right? The cadential pattern or the cadential 6/4 is traditionally 4. It can be other predominant chords, but the 4 chord I think is the one that sort of led to its invention. And that's it. The cadential 6/4 is the use of the 1/6/4 between a predominant chord, usually 4, resolving to the 5/7. At the cadence. In other words, complete 5/7 with 2 in the soprano typically. I'm not talking about early in the phrase. Does that make sense? And it is absolutely true. 1/6/4 chords will be heard at the end of the phrase, not generally early on. They define the cadence. Okay? Got a little message here. I can close it out. I jokingly call it the second bass chord. Because if you hear... there's hum. Right? So I joke when you hear the 1/6/4, you're two steps from home. Does that make sense? And again, this sort of impresses upon you that, yes, this chord really did evolve for a specific reason at a specific place in the phrase. Because when you hear it all by its lonesome, your ear automatically assumes that that's what's going to follow. if that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Once you sort of wrap our mind around that there are sort of places historically where it made sense for these sort of harmonies to evolve, this idea of placing chords in inversion. But again, they're in set patterns, they don't just happen at random. Then there's actually one other place in this phrase that we can easily describe another use of a second inversion chord, and it has to do right here. If you take a moment and think about the use of second inversion in this progression 1-4-1, specifically at this moment, what does that do? How does that change your baseline?
Well, if you're thinking resolve common tone, you should keep the C.
Yeah, and of course, yeah, and up here it did, but then also there is the potential, why could the common tone not be held in the bass?
Right.
And the answer is it could.
Yeah.
It just means that this chord is now in inversion.
Yeah.
It is in second inversion, fifth in the bass,
Yeah.
therefore 4-6-4.
Yep.
And that is the use of the 4-6-4 chord. In fact, I think you would be hard pressed to find a 4-6-4 chord in standard traditional music that is not preceded and followed by 1, because the point of the 4-6-4 chord is that it holds that common tone in the bass. Right? So you can take a tonic expansion 4 chord, place it in second inversion, and actually the bass note is held, is all that means. And I've seen two different terms to describe this. I like to think of it as the pedal 6-4.
There's the pedal 6-4.
Yeah, and the term pedal, of course, is reminiscent of playing organ, where often a pedal note is held and then all this junk is played over top of it, whether that note in the bass matches or not, right? That's a standard sort of organ fare, is to place a extended held note in the bass, even if it becomes a non-chord tone. But here's a case where you could hold that note in a organ pedal, and it's actually not a non-chord tone, it belongs to the next harmony as well. And of course, when we learn our little piano cadence patterns, right, that's typically how we teach students to play the 4 chord, is in second inversion, because they don't have to move the hand right at the beginning, right?
So the whole idea of doubling your root when you're in inversions goes out the window.
Yes, and that is the next point. Yes, when you put a note different than the root in the bass, it doesn't. The assumption then is not that is that you're still doubling the root of the chord. Mm-hmm. And I will say quickly, you're using the terms right, and students will use the term root sometimes when actually they mean bass note, and it's not the same. We've been looking at bass notes that are the roots of chords. Here's an example where the bass note is not the root of the chord. It's the fifth, that's the bass note. For second inversion chords, the guideline that basically holds true, it does hold true. Turns out, in second inversion, doubling the bass note
You're doubling
is the correct doubling.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay. And so while we've said to this point double the root, now we can actually, when it comes to second inversion, double the bass. Mm-hmm. And of course, you can also say in root position double the bass. And in some respects, that's almost a better guideline, just double the bass note. The time that you don't double the bass note is in first inversion, and we'll get to first inversion down the road. Okay. But hopefully this makes sense. These are two of your 6-4 chords that we see commonly. The cadential 6-4, which is the tonic 6-4, following a predominant chord, and then resolving to the 5-7 at the cadence. Again, not early in the phrase, at the cadence. That's why it's cadential 6-4. And then the pedal 6-4. Okay. I will mention some books call this an auxiliary 6-4. The idea being that this note is held, and then you have these neighbor tones. Mm-hmm. And some books call neighbor tones, to sound fancier, auxiliary tones. I think that's kind of a British preference, is auxiliary tone. And so I have seen this progression called the auxiliary 6-4 because you have two voices holding the common tones. This is not, however, parallel octaves, by the way, because there's no motion, right? Holding an octave is not parallel octaves because nothing has moved, what's forbidden is parallel motion, not